Hey, Mal. Hi, Nicola. Hi, Vicky. Just giving people a few more minutes and then we can get going. If you can hear me, just put a smiley face in the chat bar so I know you can hear me. This platform annoyingly doesn't let us actually speak to each other. Brilliant. I don't know whether anyone's used this platform before, but I sometimes really struggle with it because I quite like to have, weirdly, some human interaction. So, we've got... I think we'll just give another minute or so and then we'll get going. We've got about an hour we put in. It might take that long. I don't see it taking all the way up to 11, so you guys might get some time back, which I know is always delightful for everybody to be able to squeeze some time back, especially in November. As if your November has been anything like our November, it has been absolutely jam-packed. So I am very much looking forward to a Christmas break. Right, I'm going to get started. If people join, amazing, and they can join halfway through. As Mel has said there, thank you so much, Mel. So Mel is amazing. She's part of my team over here at Rangam, and she'll be able to either answer any questions that you might have along the way in the chat bar or save them up for the end. The other thing you can do after today is just get in touch with us if you want to have a longer discovery call with us about who Rangam are and how we might be able to work with your business to create inclusive hiring and retention programs for you. So creating an inclusive hiring program for neurodivergent talent, or hiring process for neurodivergent talent. So for me, and I guess the reason you guys are here, is creating inclusive interviewing is key to creating diverse teams. And why do we want diverse teams? Is, we want diverse teams because not only is it a good thing to have, but actually it creates innovative products, it creates a really efficient team, and it enables us to work to everybody's strengths without having all of the same person being really good at one thing and then there's a real gap somewhere else. I like to describe it as a little bit like a car engine. So in a car engine, every single piece does something really different, and that's what makes it run really efficiently as a whole. And I think in my mind, that's how I see neurodiverse and diverse teams running. I think the reason I use that analogy quite a lot at the moment is because I'm learning to drive. So driving and cars are in my brain, but I think it's a really good way to start kind of seeing and visualizing and really describing to other leaders in your business of why you want to create diverse teams. It's a really good visual representation for how a team can run really efficiently and smoothly. However, to do that, within our usual interview and hiring processes, there's usually 3 key areas of challenge. Now, there might be subcategories to each area, but I like to kind of categorize them to 3 key areas, and that is our language that we use, our interview process itself, and our unconscious bias. When often you mention unconscious bias, or you say unconscious bias, people often feel, I don't know whether threatened is the word, but often immediately feel really bad that they might have unconscious bias. And for me, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a natural thing that exists. And to move past unconscious bias, we have to accept that we all have it to be able to challenge ourselves into doing something a little bit differently. So we'll cover that slightly later in the deck. The other thing to be key here is this is a whistle-stop tour. So it will by no means cover every single element in great detail, or every way a neurodivergent person may struggle with the hiring process, because obviously we're all really different. So lots of the information within this is around autistic candidates, but actually what an autistic candidate might struggle with in the interview or hiring process could be very different to an ADHD candidate struggling through the interviewing hiring process. So we do provide wider training that goes into everything in a much more granular detail to create that fully inclusive hiring program. So as a starting point, I think I've gone over most of this. We're going to touch on, I say cover in wide detail, but we're going to touch on, writing accessible job descriptions, some interview challenges, tips and techniques. We'll touch on disclosure and also post-interview communication. So one of the things that lots of businesses are starting to do better and quite well is trying to put adaptations in to make your interviewing process really accessible. One of the things businesses aren't necessarily confident at doing is providing feedback. And actually the feedback piece is really key to be able to help that neurodivergent person improve, identify gaps and know what they could do differently next time. So don't we will touch on it, but again, if you want to have any more information about that, then you can contact myself or Mel after today and we can talk through that in a little bit more detail with you. So writing an accessible job description. So language is, I think, the most inaccessible part of any hiring process, and that's not just for neurodivergent candidates. That's for women, from intersectionality. So language can be the most inaccessible thing. How we talk, an example would be in a sales job, how we talk about targets can be very masculine and maybe put some women off. Within the neurodivergent community, often job descriptions, the format of a job description can be really inaccessible. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about the text used, the size of font used, the amount of words used, how bullet points are set out on the page. For example, I've got ADHD, and when I look at a job description that's very, very wordy, in Arial 12 font, I just cannot process the information. It takes me so long to pull out the salient bits of information that I need to prepare for the interview that sometimes it just puts me off being able to get started. So some key things not to do. So avoid using company jargon. And I think we're all really guilty of this. When we write a job description, we often go, right, well, we know the job. We are hiring into this gap we've got because somebody's left. And we write the job based on assuming knowledge of the candidate coming through. So it's really important once you've written a job description to proofread it once or twice, just from the basis of company jargon. And so an example might be in our industry, when we're working within the disability sector, we might put in there, you need knowledge of access to work, or ATW. Now, ATW probably doesn't mean anything to anybody if someone is going for that role. So it's really, really important to explain that, or provide a glossary of what those things would mean. Because actually then a glossary, if you're in an interview and you use that jargon, you've got that glossary there as well to fall back on, so the candidate does feel very prepared. Don't use large blocks of text. Don't make vague statements. For example, requires strong organisational skills. Because actually what are strong organisational skills? If, as I mentioned, I've got ADHD, if in a job description it said strong organisational skills, in the typical sense of strong organisational skills, I probably don't have them. It's not something that comes very naturally to me, but it doesn't mean it should disqualify me from doing a role. Because my role at the moment, for an example, is I lead on our EMEA operations and our expansion into the UK, which does require quite strong organisational skills, but how I implement those is probably very different to what might have been expected of me when I started the post. So be really clear on those vague statements and try and think about whether it's actually necessary, or actually whether you have a lot of automation within your business that supports those organisational skills for your candidates. And another thing people often forget to do wrong on their job descriptions is including anything about your disability confident commitments or your DE&I commitments. If on your job description you can put very clear information about why you are committed to DE&I, if there's any information on your website that you can link to about how you want to encourage applicants to let you know about, to disclose to you, because actually with disclosure, that's when you know about the adaptations you can put in at a later date. All of those things are key to include in your job description. If you don't have that information on your website, then I would really encourage you to start to build that information up. It doesn't have to be really detailed. It could just be, we are open to putting in any adaptations necessary to help you succeed. Some examples of this are, you could list some key examples out, but we have a person in the business that can discuss with you any adaptations that would be possible, and here's an email address to contact that person. All of those things help you create accessible and inclusive hiring processes. So what to do when writing a job description is outline your requirements, key skills in concise terms. I'm not going to go through all this in all details because you've got it. I can share this afterwards. Put yourself in the candidate's shoes. And again, that comes back to avoiding company jargon. If you don't if it's not clear to you, how is it going to be clear to the candidate? Utilize your employee resource groups if you've got them within the business. Ask someone there to review all of your job descriptions or create a guidance for you. They can be really key in finding the gaps that maybe you're missing in those accessible job descriptions. The other thing to think about before your job description as well is where you're posting your roles. So if you're looking to hire diverse talent into the business and you want to create a hiring process, really you want to be accessing the candidates that are diverse or neurodivergent. And to do that, it's about diversifying where you're going to post those roles and how you post those roles. So if you use LinkedIn or social media to post the roles, what language are you using there? Are you using camel case hashtags? Are you describing what's in the image if you're using one? All of those creates further accessibility. Which job boards are you using? Is it job boards that people that are neurodivergent might be using to see those roles? Again, all of these are key in being able to bring that diverse talent into your business. Here at SourceAbled, we have our own jobs board, and we do a lot of work accessing other talent providers, universities, candidates. So any roles that then are advertised through us, neurodivergent candidates know that one, they're going to be accessible, and two, they're going to be having adaptations provided to them in the hiring process, which can then really help your business access that talent in a really structured way. So let's move on to interviewing. So if you've got all of your accessible job descriptions, you've got someone through that next stage. Interviewing is the next challenge or hurdle you will come across. Sorry, I'm just reading. I get really distracted by comments, which is great, Vic. I was just reading something there. As an ND, I have no instinct for if a role will actually make an offer I can accept. Yeah. Yeah, I think salary. So, Vic, that's a really interesting question. And I just think salary is key when posting roles. And I agree with you. Businesses are so reluctant to posting salaries. And I really don't know why. Because actually, if you want to get the best candidates coming in, you need to be posting that salary early. So I guess there's a couple of ways that you could do that. One, encouraging businesses to do that is one, maybe not post it on your salary, but put something on your job description that says, we're really happy to discuss our salary range with you. Just please contact this person. So you're not making it publicly accessible. So that could be a way around it. I think the other thing is there's a lot of work to do with companies and having that cultural change piece around workplace balance and well-being at work. And I do think salary is key in that discussions, and discussing with leadership why it's important to post salary bandings. Why is there this job description that looks like it's going to be, looks like it's a leadership role, but actually when you get there, the salary is so low. So in terms of broaching that subject, I think you can definitely have the conversation early as a candidate. And actually, if then that employer still doesn't want to provide you with the salary information, maybe it's a good indicator that they're not the right employer to proceed with. I think that's probably key in any adaptations that I would suggest neurodivergent candidates ask for, and also for any employers on here as well, something worth you considering. If a neurodivergent candidate is asking or for further information to make something accessible, and if you can't give it, you need to be really clear about why you can't give it. And if there's not a clear logical reason, then you need to consider whether you need to change your approach to be able to provide that information to candidates early on. Because actually the advice I would be giving candidates, and I think candidates should be working within, is if an employer is not open to providing you with the adaptations that you need or the information that you need to progress within their hiring process, then I don't think they should be progressing in, because it shows a culture of inaccessibility. It shows a culture that you're not inclusive and you're not employee focused and you're employee wellbeing focused. Vic, I know that was a really long-winded way of trying to answer that question, and I think it is a really tough question to explore, and I think it is worth exploring further, but hopefully I've kind of touched on a few points there for you. Thanks, Vic. So the interview, let's move on to the interview. So you've got past the job description, you're in an interview, and now at the moment, we have hybrid interviews. We do much more remotely and online, which for some candidates could be really great and much more accessible. But for some neurodivergent candidates, it probably isn't as accessible. So an example, again, I'll use myself as an ADHD person. I really struggle with anything online, especially if I don't know people. And I think that comes from my body language. I move quite a lot. I might interrupt. And I've always, before having to move to remote working, I hadn't realised how much I had relied upon other people's body languages and been able to pick up on these nuances really well to know exactly then how I need to talk, when I can talk, how I can move my body, and how I can kind of keep moving in a way that helps me continue to process and focus on what's being asked of me. So for me, a virtual interview with people I don't know and have never met before, I would really, really struggle, and I would really struggle to be able to, one, process what's being asked, form a coherent response, and get through that interview. Whereas somebody that's autistic, and I don't, this isn't everybody that's autistic, but for somebody that's autistic, doing virtual online interviews might be hugely better, because they're not having to worry about body language, they're not having to worry about the nuances, they're just having to think about what's being asked and formulating that answer. So again, it's really, really different depending on what neurodivergence or what kind of diagnosis condition we're looking at for each person that's coming through. And I suppose the key thing is starting to create in your business a menu of options. So what types of things can you put together that you could offer? It doesn't have to be the same all the time, but being really, really flexible and creative in what you do to get the best out of that person. So from an interview, so the purpose of the interview is obviously about competency, but actually what we do a lot, and I think maybe the competency fit arguments comes through much more when it's face-to-face. So in an interview, what we want to get out is competency, but actually what is happening more, because of our unconscious bias, is we're looking more at the fit of a person rather than the competency of that person. So a few kind of unconscious bias interview challenges, and I don't know whether anybody has come across any of these, or if anyone wants to kind of say anything in the chat bar about any of these areas of challenges. One of the things that I think is the hardest thing for anybody to overcome within unconscious bias when interviewing is affinity bias. Now, affinity bias is when we unconsciously favour somebody we recognise ourselves within, or remind us more of ourselves or who we like because they're more like us. And we all do it. I do it. That's how, it's something that we just naturally do. And I think it's inbuilt in us to be more like that. But when you're creating a diverse team, affinity bias really hampers and prevents you creating that diverse team and creative, inclusive hiring. To overcome affinity bias, what's really key is to be really clear on where your gaps are within the team that you currently have, what role you are recruiting for, and what competency skills do you need someone to show, and have a really strong internal scoring process for that, which then means you're not then going, oh yeah, well, I didn't show that, but they were really great, we really liked that person. And by doing that, you are not ever going to get a diverse team within the business. The other thing I think that can be quite difficult from an inclusive hiring process is your contrast effect. So contrast effect is when you maybe have two candidates, both of which, you've got one candidate that, I'm sorry to keep using autism, but I'm going to use it in this scenario. You've got one candidate who's autistic, and you've got one candidate who is not neurodivergent at all. And they both answer the questions well, and they both show that they can really do the job and they have the competencies. But you decide to pick the candidate who has answered the questions in a way that was more conversational and leading that. So you're comparing two candidates to each other based on something that isn't necessary for the role. It's kind of where we think about contrast effect. And all of these things, unless you've really prepared for your hiring process, for your interview and what you're looking for, all of these things will seep in some way. So it's really good. It's really, really important to have really strong scoring processes within your interviews to be able to eliminate any unconscious bias from the interview. Confirmation bias, if anyone has ever come across that. So confirmation bias is something that we go in with a pre-existing opinion of something, and we're looking for things that will confirm our biases. Again, so in fact, you know what, I'm going to use the example of ADHD. So you might go into an interview thinking, well, ADHD people are just going to interrupt me all the time and they're not going to be very organised. And actually then what you're doing in that is looking for examples of when that person might seem like they're interrupting to confirm your prejudgment of that person, and then you're moving then through your affinity bias and contrast effect. So all of them really interact with each other. Sensory and anxiety overload. This isn't obviously an unconscious bias, but it's a key interview challenge across all neurodivergence, actually. We talk a lot about sensory and anxiety overload with autistic individuals or autistic people, especially when it comes to environment or sensory sounds, what's going on around you. Whereas I think for other neurodivergent, so again with ADHD, my overload comes when it's information overload, and I think that how it presents can be really similar to sensory overload. And sometimes in interviews or in interview prep and things that are provided, there's so much information that I kind of reach that point where I've hit the wall. I can't process anything else. I can't unpick anything, and therefore I can't kind of continue. So again, thinking about the sensory environment, think about the information you're giving in that day, thinking about the time you need to provide to candidates to process any new information, how that information is provided. Can things be provided in advance? Do you actually need to provide it in that scenario at all? And again, it will be really different from each person that you meet and each person that is neurodivergent that does interview with you. And then the halo and horns effect, which is simply put, we have a propensity to decide whether or not we like somebody within, I can't remember how the time frame, but within like 10 seconds of meeting somebody. Now that will always happen. What we need to do is try and when that has happened, start to think back to, is this fair for a start? Has this kind of halo and horns effect impacted how I'm interviewing and kind of how I'm processing the answers being given and how I'm processing this candidate through the hiring process? And the only way you can avoid these unconscious biases happening is by having really clear parameters internally about what you need the person in the role to do from a competency-based angle. So screening in and screening out. So there's lots of discussions about screening in and screening out tools within the application process. And Mel and I were actually talking about this just before we started doing this webinar today. So there's lots of discussions around psychometric tests, and I don't like psychometric tests personally, because for me, psychometric tests are about linking to affinity bias. Psychometric tests are about identifying what type of person somebody is. And then why do we need to know what type of person someone is? We don't. Because if we're doing that, we're not creating a diverse team, we're not creating an inclusive team. So wherever possible, not even wherever possible, just don't use psychometric tests. However, there are some screening tools that can be really helpful in screening in talent. So you can look for competency screening in tools that can help. And where this can really help is when somebody that is neurodivergent doesn't have a traditional employment history or traditional qualification background, but has amazing competency and skills in that area. So that can be within tech, coding, anything where there's maybe a really strong Excel, formula, finance, accounting, debt management for the company, payroll, anything that's really systems based. There's lots of screening tools that can identify competencies within that. And actually what you can do there is know that somebody has all the skills without having to rely on them showing where they've worked in the past and how they've delivered it in the past. Because I guarantee you, especially for some of the entry-level roles in your business, lots of neurodivergent talent and potentially autistic talent won't have had the same chance to gain the qualifications that you're asking for, won't have maybe had the same employment work experience history that you're asking for, but will have greater skills than those people. I guarantee you. So I would and if anyone wants us to share some of those screening tools after today, I can 100% share those with you. So just get in touch. I'll pop my email at the end, and if there's any questions around those tools, do let me know. So some common interview experience for autistic that you might have when and interviewing autistic candidates. Part of me, I will be honest, I'd quite like to update this slide, because whilst this can be common interview experiences, I don't necessarily think it reflects actually the true representation of autistic candidates within interviews. So potential untraditional greetings, a lack of interest in small talk. Now I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone on this call who might be autistic, whilst people might have a lack of interest in small talk, I think there's a lot of autistic candidates that might go to an interview thinking that that is a part of the interview. So might display really great skills with small talk, but it's not something that's ever, might be instinctive. So the amount of energy that's put into displaying as, not neurodivergent or not autistic takes away from you really being able to demonstrate the key skills within that interview. In fact, I'm going to skip past this slide, because I think what happens much more, whilst all of these elements on here could be something that interviewers might experience, I think for many it could be the complete opposite, that lots of interviewers might not experience any of this, but that's because the autistic candidate is masking, and the energy that it would take to mask some of the potential, I suppose, challenges takes away from anyone being able to do the interview effectively, or you getting all of the skills out. So this slide might be for some people, but I do think for many people you would not be able to see that they're autistic, but what you're actually doing is not ever getting the skills out of that person. Vic, yeah, rather than assume we don't do small talk, something like except that we may spend an unusually large amount of our interview energy on masking. 100%. And again, I think that's about with all neurodivergence. Like I've said, for me, an online interview, for me, I would feel like I was masking so much more online than in person. And maybe that could be the opposite for autistic candidates, that actually would feel like you're masking much more in person than you are online. And again, if you're an interviewer, that's why it's really, really important to be flexible, to speak to your candidates, to find out from that candidate what would be useful. Do not have a one-size-fits-all approach to interviewing. Inclusive interview etiquette. There's, provide empathy, always speak directly to the person. If you don't understand what is said, it's okay to repeat, then allow the person to respond. Someone said to me the other day, which was really, I found it really amazing thing that this young autistic person had done in the classroom. I was at a conference, someone was telling me about it at a conference, was their teacher had said a task to them and they didn't understand. So the student said to the teacher, look, I'm not really sure what you're saying. Could you say that again? And the teacher said it again, just louder. And the student said, I didn't say I couldn't hear you. I said I didn't understand what you're saying. So when you are interviewing, do check that what you have communicated has been communicated in a way that that person is able to process and understand. And if it hasn't been processed and understand in the way that you meant it to, you need to relook at how you are asking that and ask that in a different way. Lots of people think communication is about the receiver of the communication, but it's not. Communication always is about how you as the communicator is providing that information, and we need to be much more flexible in how we deliver those things. Now, how you can get around that in an interview scenario and avoid those pitfalls is providing questions in advance. So some interviewers don't. I think interviewers are becoming much more open to providing questions in advance, much more so than they ever were when I started asking them for candidates that I was supporting, 12, 15 years ago. And the questions in advance can be a really useful way to, one, avoid any misunderstanding, two, avoid any miscommunication, three, allow the person to really have time to process and understand what is being asked of them. And it doesn't need to be massively in advance. It could be, an hour before, just to enable that person to identify, sit and think through why those questions are being asked of them. And it will avoid so many times within an interview that could pose challenges and allow you to actually get the best from that candidate. And what that also does in providing questions in advance is help you avoid any of those unconscious bias pitfalls that you will be avoiding. And again, Vic, hopefully that also helps avoid any masking or minimise the element of having to mask in the interview because you feel so prepared on those interview questions during the interview itself. Remote interview best practices. Allow camera off option. Now, I know I'm talking about interviewing hiring processes here, but anybody that has a team and you do Teams meetings or online meetings, please allow the camera off option, because you don't know where, and especially at the end of the week, by a Friday, I am utterly exhausted that having my camera on in meetings that aren't with people I feel completely comfortable with is just too much. It's too overwhelming and I cannot process or perform in any way. So I do think within remote interviews, please do allow the camera off option at all times. Try and use a plain background if possible. Allow breaks. Using screen share can be a great way. And actually, using screen share can be a great way. So you could have the questions up in front of you. Use that screen share with the questions up and keep the camera on, because then the camera on, you still get as an interviewer what you want. I think the reason we want camera on is because as interviews, we take a lot from being able to see people. I wish I could see you all here today because I take a lot from being able to see people. But actually, when you're screen sharing with the camera on, the camera is so small in the corner that you're not as the interviewee being distracted or feeling like the camera's on, because you've got something structured in front of you to talk through. And actually having the interview questions like that brings structure for the interviewer as well as you're working through each question, and allows the interviewee to know what's coming up and how many questions you've got to go through. On-site, I think everybody really does know this, on-site interview best practices. One of the key things actually from here is a tour of the working environment, which can be transformational in helping someone feel really welcomed, feeling really comfortable, much more confident, self-assured in going into that interview. Essex County Council actually do this on all their accessible interviews and any adaptations, and it works really, really well. So they allow time before the interview itself, maybe an hour, for that person to be able to come into the building, walk around, have a tour, see where they're going to be sat, meet some people, and it just minimises some of those nerves before you go into the interview itself. Be prepared. I think I've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to go into it, but be prepared. Don't wing it. Please, just if you can prepare as much in advance, that's when you can help the person that you're interviewing focus, help them feel secure, help them feel comfortable, help them feel confident, help avoid any of those unconscious biases. And I think, we need to think of interviews isn't like it used to typically be. Interviews aren't about the employer testing the interviewer. It's about a conversation. It's about getting to know the person that you're interviewing. And if you want to get the best out of that person, you have to make them feel comfortable. And the only way you can make someone feel comfortable is by you being really prepared yourself, which I know can be really tough when we're so busy at the moment. We've got small teams with workloads of triple the team size we have. We're having to get people in really quickly, but please, taking the time to prepare saves you so much time in the long run and gets you the best person in for that role. Some tips and techniques. Again, this is all, I'm not going to go through this slide in massive detail. I'll send these all out to you. But avoiding any ambiguity, and hypothetical questions. So rather than what would you do if, what did you do then? But once again, this can all be avoided if you can provide the questions in advance, or at least screen share or share them during the interview. So you've already pre-prepared the language around those questions, so you're not having to think on your feet. Because I get it, we communicate and how it comes naturally to us. So sometimes it's really hard to avoid hypotheticals or asking things ambiguously, because it's not, that might be naturally how we communicate. So if you've prepared, you're then able to avoid some of those pitfalls with ambiguous language. Post-interview communications for your unsuccessful candidates. Provide feedback. And I know it can be really tough to provide feedback, especially when nobody wants to upset anybody. Nobody wants to say, well, actually, you didn't perform well in this area. But being really clear on the feedback is so important. So many people say, there was a better fit. What does that mean, there was a better fit? Is that your unconscious bias, or actually, was there a better fit because the better fit had more experience of this, 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 and this? And if that's the case, say that in your feedback. Because then that person knows, that candidate knows what they might need to do the next time, or where some of their skills gaps are that they could start working towards to get that job. As an interviewer, don't just think about getting people in for your team. When we're creating diverse teams, that whole process, where there's for the unsuccessful candidates, can help them get a role elsewhere. We all have a part to play in helping neurodivergent people access employment successfully. So try and see your part as that post-interview communication, however you feel it's negative, as a step towards supporting people into employment in other areas. Always obviously start with positives. That's always key. And it's an opportunity for you to get feedback. So ask the candidate, how did you think? Was there anything we could have done differently to have helped with some of these things? Because from both sides, you learn again how to do it differently in the future. They learn how to, that candidate learns how to do it differently in the future, and we're always improving, we're always learning. Successful candidates. So when extending the job offer, ensure that the role is laid out clearly. Provide a clear timeline. So I think so many times in the past we've said, oh, you've got the job, this is great. And then there's no clear timeline of, okay, when do you need this information by? If there's any, supporting documentation, passports, if you need to do any documentation before that person starts. What start date are you working towards? On the first day at work, what are the expectations? Where should someone go? Or who should somebody speak to? Does somebody need to bring in their own equipment for the day? I'm hoping not, but sometimes that might be unavoidable. All of those elements are really key. And before someone starts, what is that person's work plan for the first 2 weeks? So often people start work and don't really feel busy enough, don't really know what to do, and that can create huge anxiety. So can you make a person's week full? I'm not talking like overwhelmingly full, but full in terms of structure out. This is the training I want you to do then. Then you can meet with this person. And then maybe have within those 2 weeks to a month a project running in the background that person can start working towards. So it helps them feel part of the team. It helps them feel useful. And it doesn't, if someone doesn't know what to do or doesn't know the expectations or doesn't feel busy, for many neurodivergent candidates, they don't necessarily want to say that to their employer or manager because they don't want people to feel, they're worried of the negative feedback or people thinking that they can't do the job when maybe they've missed something. Maybe someone has said I should be doing something and I've just not thought about it. So have everything written down for the first day, first week, first 2 weeks, first month, because that again will transform someone being able to come into your business and thrive, or come into your business feel really anxious. And in feeling really anxious, that will also create much more work for you as a manager or as an interviewer. So what should you do if someone discloses their disability, neurodivergence to you? And you know what? Stay curious. Someone said that to me, if we want to create open conversation, we have to be curious. And I'm not saying, you have to ask lots of details, but show that you care. Ask that person to share anything with you that they think would be really great for you to read. Lots of neurodivergent people have already done a lot of reading. They will have already found articles or blog posts or things that they feel really represents them. So asking them to share that with you helps you build that picture of what their neurodivergence means to them, and then helps you start talking through what types of adaptations you can implement to help someone succeed and thrive. When you're talking about neurodivergence and adaptation, always be positive, always talk to them from a strengths-based process and how someone can succeed. Please avoid using how can we help you with challenges, because for many that's a trigger. I think for many neurodivergent people, any language around challenge, deficit, gaps can really trigger somebody and create quite a lot of anxiety. I know it really triggers me if someone speaks to me in that language. So using strengths-based, success, thriving language will help the conversation move forward and actually help you develop a really great working relationship with your employee. Some of the reasons people disclose: to get job accommodations, work in a way that supports success, creating positive message and feeling comfortable and safe. And your job, I suppose, as a hiring manager is to enable and empower those candidates coming through to feel all of those things. And if someone feels all of those things, you get the best possible person for the job, and you create those incredible diverse teams that are efficient and effective in how they run. So thank you so much for coming along this morning and listening to me. Like I said, this is I could talk about this for hours and hours. But this is very much a whistle-stop tour of neurodivergence and creating inclusive processes, hiring processes. If anybody wants to get in touch with us after today, our emails, we'll contact you all to say that if you come in, we'll pop a quick email in there that you can reach out if you want to have a discovery call with myself, Mel, or anyone in the team about how Rangam and our Source Abled framework can support you to create inclusive hiring processes. So that's great. We do have 10 minutes left if there are any questions. So open to any questions now if people do have them. Equally, it's fine if you don't. It's always hard at the end to think about questions, but thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nikki. Thank you so much, Vic. Hopefully, you don't mind us, we'll just pop you a quick email after today with the slides in we'll share, and then also any further information that might be helpful. Do let me know if you want any information on the screening tools I mentioned. But thank you so much, and have a fabulous rest of your day.